A young couple in Seoul hands a stranger $300,000 and signs a lease for an apartment. They will pay no monthly rent, and 2 years later, the broker says they will get the entire sum back. It is, for all intents and purposes, free rent. They signed feeling very clever, but the building, in the trade's own terms, was underwater the day they moved in. The owner was behind on their payments. And when it goes to auction after foreclosure, the deposit vanishes. Half of it was their savings, the other half was borrowed from a bank, and the renter's bank loan does not vanish like their home did. This is jeonse, Korea's all-deposit rental system, and the deposits behind it add up to one of the largest unsecured lending pools in the country. The people funding it skew young, often first-time renters in their 20s and 30s, and roughly half of them borrow the deposit from a bank to put it down. When the landlord defaults and the bank forecloses, the renter's savings vanish while they still owe the debt, meaning that they not only got screwed over on their life savings and possibly much of their families, but also a loan they still have to pay, and they still have no house. Over 5 years, the state's guarantee fund has logged more than 50,000 cases of deposits never returned, totaling more than 11 trillion won. I'm Sam Suhan, and I'm going to take you through 3 passes over the whole kit and caboodle. First, what a jeonse tenant has actually signed once you take the word rent out of it. Second, the assembly line of fraud that grew on top of the system and why treating that fraud as the disease misses what is actually wrong with the system. And finally, the single change that would disarm both the criminal and the overextended in one motion, which is also the change Korea cannot afford to make. The word rent gets in the way of what's really happening. A jeonse tenant pays a lump sum, often half to 4/5 of what the property is worth, hands it to a stranger, and the stranger keeps it for 2 years. No interest accrues to the tenant, and no neutral account holds the money in reserve. So why would anyone hand their entire savings to a stranger instead of just buying a place or paying rent month to month? Because for most young Koreans, buying was never really an option. Mortgages are harder to get and smaller than what an American would expect, so a direct purchase is off the table. Paying monthly, what Koreans call jeonse, means handing over money that is simply gone at the end of each month with nothing coming back. Next to that, jeonse looks like the responsible choice. You hand over a lump sum, you pay nothing month to month, and you are told you get all of it back in 2 years, so it does not feel like spending at all. It feels like saving, a deposit you will hand back to yourself later and roll into a home of your own. And for 50 years, that is more or less how it worked. Your parents did it, got their money back, and moved up. Saying yes to jeonse was not reckless. In fact, it was the normal thing to do. That logic held for decades. What none of these renters were told is that the one thing keeping it safe had quietly disappeared. See, the owner does not park it in a vault. A responsible owner might put it into his savings account to earn a little on it safely, but they also might put it into another building, into their restaurant, or into the loan they took to buy the first building. At the end of the lease, he is meant to produce the entire sum on demand, out of whatever he did with it, out of the next tenant's deposit, or out of a sale. So what the tenant has actually signed is a loan for 2 years to a stranger he never ran a credit check on, at 0 interest, secured by nothing. If the stranger goes under, the entire loss is the tenant's, and that loss can be substantial. A 30-something renter in a Seoul apartment now puts down an average deposit of around 413 million won, roughly the same $300,000 the couple in the cold open handed over, and about half of it is borrowed. In Seoul, those deposit loans go disproportionately to people in their 20s and 30s. The money handed to the stranger is only partly the tenant's. The rest belongs to a bank, which means that if the owner goes under, the tenant loses the savings and still owes the bank. The deposit and the debt do not cancel each other out. One vanishes and the other stays. On DC Inside, a popular Korean forum, a man in his 20s described the moment the jeonse nightmare became real. A court notice had arrived in the mail giving him until February 26 to file a claim on the apartment he lived in because the building was going to auction. He had sunk more than 100 million won into the deposit, most of it borrowed, telling himself that even in a crash he could pull it back out and ride the loss. The crash came, the money was gone, and the loan that paid for it was not. Before he had turned 30, he sat with what was left, a debt the size of the apartment and no apartment, and wrote that it was finally sinking in that his life was over. To understand why anyone does this, start with the builder's problem. He has put up a new low-rise and cannot sell it because these units move slowly and there are too many of them. A consulting firm comes to him with an offer. They will get him the price he wanted, sometimes more, and they keep whatever they bring in above that. He has no reason to turn it down. The trick is that in jeonse, nobody is bound to a real sale price. The deposit is just a number the listing sets, and the tenant pays it as a lump sum. So instead of finding a buyer, the firm puts the building up for jeonse and prices the deposit higher than the building is actually worth. A brand new building lets them get away with it because it has no past sales for the tenant to check against. The tenant hands over that lump sum, it covers the construction cost the building wanted covered, and the padding on top of that belongs to the firm to split. That extra is the rebate, and it is paid for delivering a warm body, a tenant who will sign. Reporters at the Hanguk Ilbo got inside the listing app that only brokers and sales staff use, the one a renter never sees. Every new building sits there with two prices, a sale price and a deposit. And on the units built for this, the two are set at the same figure. Besides each one is an R. Bring a buyer and the broker collects one payout. Bring a tenant who signs the deposit and the broker collects another. On one unit in Huagokdong, the deposit was 380 million, identical to the sale price, and 15 million of that deposit was the rebate. The builder put in none of it. The tenant's own money paid every middleman in the chain, carved out before the deposit did a single thing, and no one told the tenant it was happening. By the sales staff's own count, around 90% of new low-rise units across Seoul and the surrounding area are sold this way. The trade calls it simultaneous progression. Once you lay the assembly line out flat, the word fraud is too small for it because each step on its own is a transaction that looks completely ordinary. Put them end to end and they hand a tenant a full price bill for a building that was never worth what they paid. The last step solves a problem the scheme has made for itself. The inflated deposit got the builder his money and the firm its cut, but it left a debt sitting 2 years out. When the lease ends, the tenant will want the whole deposit back, and the building cannot produce it because it was never worth that much. Someone has to be the legal owner standing there when that day comes, and none of the people who took the money want it to be them. So they bring in a stand-in to take the title. The pitch is that you can own a building for none of your own cash and sell it in 2 years for a gain, and the firm even covers your taxes and hands you a few $100,000 on top. The people who say yes are people in financial trouble, people who cannot read the contract they are signing, and in at least one case, a homeless man whose name ended up on more than 200 homes. They have no money and no way to ever return a deposit, and that is exactly why they were chosen. The property tax alone will cost them several times what they were paid. When the deposit finally comes due and the building goes to auction, the person on the title is a nobody with nothing to take, and the builder, the consulting firm, and the brokers are long gone with the cash. The tenant is left suing a name. That covers one route. The law leaves a second opening, and it needs none of this machinery. A tenant's legal claim on the property does not take effect until midnight on the day after they move in. So a landlord can mortgage the building on the morning the tenant is carrying in the furniture, and that loan sits ahead of the tenant in line. When the building goes to auction, the bank collects first, and the deposit is whatever is left, which is usually nothing. The gap has been public for years, and a change that would start the tenant's protection the moment they register has been proposed and not passed. Okay, if that felt like a lot, that is kind of the point. The complexity is not an accident sitting on top of the machine. The complexity is how the machine works. A tenant thinks he is signing a lease, but his deposit can be used to pay the builder, pay the broker, fund the rebate, create the paper owner, and still leave him behind the bank if a mortgage is placed at the right moment. So stripped down, the whole thing is simple. The renter brings the money, everyone else gets paid first, and when the building fails, the person who thought he was just renting discovers he was the lender all along. All of this, everything you just saw, is recent. The consulting firms, the placeholder owners, the listing app, and the mortgage timed to the morning of the move. All of it grew up in the last decade or two, and all of it is bolted onto something far older that was never a crime at all. Take the criminals out completely, and a jeonse deposit is still a loan a tenant hands to a stranger with nothing set aside to cover it. That arrangement goes back centuries, and it carried the same flaw then that it carries now. A military officer named No Song Chu kept a diary from 1763 to 1829, and in it, he recorded a dispute with his landlord that any jeonse victim today would recognize on sight. He could not get his deposit back. He got it back only because his landlord had taken a fresh deposit from a new tenant and used that money to pay him off. No wrote, with the sourness of a man who can see the shape of the whole thing, that the incoming tenant had been cheated too. The daisy chain at the center of every modern collapse, paying the tenant who leaves with the money of the tenant who arrives, was already running inside a single Chosun house 2.5 centuries ago, long before anyone thought to build a machine around it. So the structure carries the danger on its own, and it has carried it the whole time. A deposit this exposed, running for that many generations, should have wrecked people long before the 2020s, so something must have been holding the risk down. Before that something makes sense, you have to see how a private custody became the way an entire country housed itself. In the 1970s, the state pushed capital towards exporters and left ordinary people to fend for themselves. For a landlord, borrowing from a bank was, in the language of the time, harder than picking stars out of the sky. So he raised money the only way left to him, from the people who wanted to live in his building. The deposit functioned as an effectively interest-free bank loan supplied by a tenant with no other route into stable housing. By 1975, 38% of Seoul households held their homes this way, against 14% paying monthly. The story Korea still recites is the first rung of a ladder. Rent to deposit to ownership, a poor country housing itself without a mortgage market. That story was true once, and the thing that made it true was high interest rates. When the money in a bank earned double digits, the landlord had every reason to keep the tenant's deposit somewhere recoverable, because the safe place was also the profitable place. The tenant's protection was never written into law. It lived entirely in the landlord's interest in not losing the money, which made it a side effect of an interest rate. It held as long as the rate held. But eventually, rates fell, and the reason the system worked went with them. A deposit sitting in a low-yield account is dead weight. The same money pushed into a rising property market is leverage on terms a regulated lender would never offer. A slug of capital, interest-free, that you are trusted to return only after 2 years. The deposit stopped being savings the landlord babysat and became venture funding for the riskiest end of Korean real estate, raised from the people least able to survive a loss. The marketing did not change, but the machine underneath the system turned over completely. When the National Deposit Price Index peaked in the spring of 2022 and then fell hard through the following year, the interest had no margin to absorb it because the tenant had been carrying the risk the entire time. The dip in housing prices landed on renters who had been told they were saving. At scale, the daisy chain that No Song-chu watched run through a single house now runs through entire districts. When a landlord owns 1,000 buildings, each tenant's exit depends on a new tenant's entry, and the chain holds only as long as deposits keep rising and new renters keep arriving. The moment renewal deposits came in lower than the originals, owner who had spent the money, the honest and the crooked alike, owed a difference they did not have, and the chain seized up one building at a time. The press happened to name some of them. A builder called the Construction King controlled roughly 2,700 homes across Incheon and the surrounding province on almost none of his own money. One of his tenants scraped together 10 million won when the owner asked for an increase, and 5 months later found a notice on his door that the building was going to auction. He lost the 85 million won he had saved over a lifetime. These were not careless people. One had lost his job, then watched the bank refuse to roll over the loan he had used to pay his deposit. A woman in the same case stood to get back nothing at all because her savings sat just over the cutoff for even a partial refund. By the time the court reached its first verdict, 4 of the tenants in Incheon did not survive it. A second landlord, the Villa King, held 1,139 homes bought entirely on tenants' deposits. Then he died. To get money back through the guarantee fund, a tenant must formally notify the landlord that the lease is over, but there was nobody to notify. His parents refused to inherit his debts, so the tenants could not even begin the process until a court appointed someone to stand in for the dead man so that he could be sued. The paperwork was frozen by a death the system had no procedure for. The fixes on the table all run the same way. Make the landlord buy guarantee insurance. Tighten the fund's underwriting, cap the deposit as a share of the property's value, lengthen the sentences. Every one of them works to make the unsecured creditor feel a little safer about an unsecured loan, and none of them touches the thing that makes the loan unsecured, which is that the landlord gets to spend the principal. Of course, there is a simpler fix. Lock the deposit in genuine escrow, untouchable by the landlord, releasable to the tenant when the lease ends. Sever the owner's access to the principal, and the entire supply chain above it has nothing left to eat. There is no rebate to skim from a deposit that cannot be spent, and no reason to recruit a placeholder to hold a building whose deposit is locked. And the same lock saves the tenant of the honest landlord too, because a deposit that was never spent is a deposit a falling market cannot vaporize. It is still sitting there when the lease ends. So the fix that everyone knows exists just sits there. It is cheap, it is obvious, and a country that has watched people die over this could pass it tomorrow. It will not, and the reason runs all the way to the bottom of why jeonse exists at all. Look one more time at the thing the honest landlord and the con artist have in common. Both of them get to spend the deposit. That permission is the entire function of the arrangement. A jeonse deposit is a loan, and the entire point of a loan is that the money gets used. Lock it in escrow, and there is no jeonse left to fix. You have switched the system off. And the money it lets them spend is staggering. Tenants' deposits quietly fund a huge share of Korean household and small landlord liquidity, a standing pool of interest-free credit handed over by renters who were told they were saving, holding up entire balance sheets across the country. That money is working right now, this second, in other buildings, in businesses, in the loans landlords took to buy the buildings in the first place. So the choice in front of the state was always the same one: protect the tenant or keep the lending. Locking the deposits would read as a housing reform and hit like a monetary contraction, ripping that funding out of the economy overnight and forcing a country to start paying interest on money it has borrowed from its own young for 50 years and never paid a cent for. Put the lives this has already cost on one side of that scale and the entire shadow credit supply of a nation on the other, and the tenants lose. They lose every time because the tenant was always the lender the whole system runs on. So the system does with them what it does with any lender it depends on. It comes back for more. Somewhere in Seoul this afternoon, another young couple who feel very clever are signing. Korea is only the clearest version of something that runs in a lot of places. Here, the instrument is naked. Nobody pretends the deposit is anything but an enormous sum the tenant fronts and the owner gets to spend. Everywhere else, the same trade wears a costume. A deposit on a pre-construction flat, a security bond the landlord is free to invest, money put up by the person who needs the place and put to work by the person who already owns it. Same shape with better presentation. You have seen who is really lending here, who is really borrowing, and how the risk gets priced at 0 and carried at 100. That is not a Korean quirk. It is one of the oldest arrangements there is. The people who own things financing themselves on the backs of people who need them, and it scales all the way up to how a country is financed. Once you see it in Seoul, you cannot unsee it anywhere. So walk away from this with the one question this whole system is built so you never think to ask. Who is actually funding this, and do the people funding it know they are the credit the whole market runs on? If you like this video, join my newsletter. The link is in the description, where you'll also find the sources I cited for this video. Subscribe if you want more of these, and I'll see you in the next one.